would first of all like to thank you for taking out some precious time of your schedule to come here and watch the debate. This is a collaborative event between PYA, the Pakistan Youth Alliance, and the UTM Debating Club, UTMDBC. We are bringing a debate here to discuss one of the most hot topics which has been plaguing not only international relations scholars, but people all around the world who are interested in global politics. The internal turmoil in Pakistan has largely become an international concern, and the position of the US in the international arena justifies its interference into Pakistani affairs. This is the case topic we're discussing today, and presenting to you the speaker panel today. First of all, I'd like to introduce Professor Baumgartner. Dr. Justin Baumgartner, one of our most esteemed panelists, has earned a PhD in political science from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. And with him will be in his team Mr. Kamran Bukhari. Kamran Bukhari, one of our most esteemed panelists, is one of the Toronto-based the Toronto-based Vice President of Middle Eastern and South Asian Affairs with Stratfor, a global intelligence company headquartered in Austin, Texas. This is our first panel who will be speaking for the motion of the House today. I would like to introduce the panel who will be speaking against the motion of the House today, and I would first like to introduce Professor Arne Jurgensen. He's a professor at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. Our final panelist is also a professor, Professor Murtaza Haider. Murtaza Haider, who is a PhD in the Associate Dean of Research and Graduate Programs at the Ted Rogers School of Management at Ryerson University in Toronto, Canada. Professor Haider also holds a adjunct professorship of engineering at McGill University and the University of Toronto. His research focuses on housing markets, urban infrastructure development, transport and logistics management. Professor Haider has also undertaken research in housing supply in Canada. US-Pakistan relations have been something which has been discussed a lot throughout time. Natural allies during times of Afghan war, the war on terror, from the point of the Indo-Pakistan war on Bangladesh, US has always stood beside Pakistan. But recent incidents such as the drone strikes in Pakistan, which has killed 24 soldiers of the Pakistani army, has brought in cracks in relations between these two allies, which have been together for a long time. US has been supplying aid to Pakistan for a long time and is one of its major benefactors in a very, very political turmoil region in South Asia. The relations have been getting complicated with time, and it's been something of diplomatic deadlock for some time right now. And this is something which I guess our audience will like to hear from the esteemed panelists. I would like to remind the audience of the case topic today. The motion today we are presenting is the internal turmoil in Pakistan has largely become an international concern, and the position of the United States in the international arena justifies its interference into Pakistan's internal affairs. To speak for the motion, first of all, I would like to invite Professor Justin Baumgartner.
Sorry, but before I begin, I think I might want to adjust the volume on this because I think it's too high and we're getting some feedback. Okay, is that better, or is that too loud, not loud enough, or? Perfect. Okay. All right, so just let me know when you're starting the watch.
Whenever you're ready.
Okay. In the next 7 minutes, I want to try to answer 3 questions related to our debate topic tonight. The first one is, why is the turmoil in Pakistan an international concern? Secondly, how does this threaten Pakistan? And third, why is U.S. and international intervention justified? So let me start with the first question. Why is turmoil in Pakistan an international concern? Well, largely, more than any other reason, it's because of the threat of international terrorism. The 9/11 attacks, of course, happened back in 2001. They killed almost 3,000 people. The attacks came from Osama bin Laden and the Al-Qaeda terrorist network, who were being harbored by the Taliban in Afghanistan. Of course, that led to the Afghanistan war, which removed the Taliban and Al-Qaeda from Afghanistan, causing them to flee to neighboring Pakistan. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, and other international terrorists are sheltered in the federally administrated tribal areas, which I'll just call FATA to save time from here on out, in northwest Pakistan, as well as other parts of Pakistan. FATA represents the badlands of Pakistan, in which the Pakistani government is not able to administer, law and order. It's a hotbed for radical militant Islam. Terrorists from FATA have successfully plotted bombings all over the world in places like London, England, Madrid, Spain, Bali, Indonesia, Islamabad, Pakistan. There was a plan to detonate liquid explosives on airlines that were flying to Canada, so even Canada's been a target. Osama bin Laden, of course, was killed last year on May the 2nd in Abbottabad, Pakistan, by U.S. Navy SEALs. And, because the world's #1 terrorist was in Pakistan for 9.5 years, shows that there's an international threat in Pakistan. But it's not just an international threat, it's also a threat to Pakistan, to the Pakistani people that live there. The Pakistani Taliban has turned against the government, and it's been waging a civil war against it. It's seized territory in the past in places like the Swat Valley. It's occupied shops and government buildings. The Taliban has a goal to impose Islamic fundamentalist Sharia law to other parts of Pakistan. Pakistan has been a victim of terrorism and radical groups throughout the country. There have been many incidents, most infamously the assassination of Benazir Bhutto in December of 2007, but there have been many other lower profile cases of assassination throughout the country as well. The militants have started suicide bombing campaigns. They've captured a Pakistani fort in southern Waziristan. They've killed Pakistani security forces. Over the past decade, there have been thousands of terrorist, insurgent, and sectarian attacks in Pakistan. There have been about 40,000 civilian deaths, about 5,000 Pakistani troop deaths. About 3.5 million Pakistanis have been displaced by this conflict, forced to leave their homes. Pakistan has tried to cut a deal. They've tried to allow Sharia law, but overall peace has not worked. And still to this day, Pakistani soldiers and police are being killed and kidnapped by the Taliban. You can read about this in the papers just all the way up to this day. To talk a little bit more about the Taliban, of course, they're a product of refugee camps and radical religious schools. And to give you an example of what life has been like in areas that have been governed by the Taliban, men are forced to grow beards, women are banned from education and the workforce. They've outlawed things like music, television, chess, soccer, kite flying, other activities, punished people with lashings, amputations and executions, burned down schools and clinics, mutilated aid workers, massacred thousands of Shiite Hazaras in Afghanistan. And they want to spread this throughout Pakistan, so this is a threat to Pakistan. The people there, they have never been true citizens of Afghanistan or Pakistan, and they really exist between both. The people in FATA do not see themselves as Pakistani, and they are not loyal to the Pakistani state. Also, the Taliban use drug money to fund themselves, and Pakistan has a drug crisis with over 5 million heroin addicts. Why cannot Pakistan clear, Al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of FATA without U.S. assistance? Why would U.S. assistance be necessary? And the truth is Pakistan has not done enough. It must do more to extinguish this type of extremism within its borders, and failure to do so justifies U.S. intervention. Intervention in FATA is not a violation of Pakistani sovereignty because Pakistan has failed to enforce law and order. When international terrorism is being waged from a state's territory, that state forfeits its sovereignty unless it is able and willing to prevent it. There are many economic and social challenges in FATA. Unfortunately, it's one of the bleakest in the world when it comes to its economic and social situations. The per capita income is about $500, less than half of what the rest of Pakistan is, a 17% literacy rate, a 3% female literacy rate, few hospitals, poor health care. So I hope that this, just to sum everything up, the internal turmoil in Pakistan is an international concern because it undermines Afghanistan and the threat of international terrorism. Pakistan is threatened by radical Islam and terrorism and has paid a price in terms of lives, displacement, stability, and quality of life. The U.S. and international intervention in Pakistan is justified. It's not a violation of sovereignty. Pakistan must work closely with its allies to address these problems that threaten it and to preserve its own future as a peaceful and a secure one. Now, this foreign intervention, it need not last indefinitely, and it can end when significant progress is made. So there must be, cooperation between Pakistan and its partners. Thank you.
Mr. Murtaza Haider, who's going to be speaking against the motion today.
Thank you. Now, I had my notes, but after listening to my friend here, I think I'm going to forgo my notes and speak, because seldom someone has referred to my homeland as Badlands, so it's going to be a different conversation today. Well, I'm one of those people who in this room can speak fluent Pashto and is from that part of Pakistan that's called the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, and the next to it is tribal land. What has just happened here in the last few minutes is a complete reversal of cause and effect. And I'm not disagreeing on the effects, but I'm disagreeing about the cause of those effects. There's no denying the fact, and I'm not disagreeing with the fact that 40,000 Pakistanis have died. About 3,600 Pakistani military troops have died. There have been bomb blasts a dozen a day. All of that is true. The fact that Pakistan's economy is almost ruined, that is true. The fact that there's a war going on in Pakistan, that is true. But the war is not between the Taliban and Pakistan. The war is between the United States, NATO, and Pakistanis. There's a war going on in Pakistan, and this war is imposed on the people of Pakistan, even though you see fatalities only in one part of Pakistan. The attacks by unmanned planes called drones kill dozens every day in Pakistan, in the federally administered tribal areas. Now, you ask yourself this fundamental question. If Taliban are as bad as they are, and they are, I'm not denying the fact, they are responsible for all these atrocities, what were they doing before 2001? Did they all just were born in 2001? Did these madrasas do not exist in 2001? And for those of you who are not old enough to know, I saw Brzezinski making a speech in Pakistan telling the same Pashtuns, go back, fight for your lands and mosques and take them back from the evil Russians. I was there, I saw that speech. So they were trained to fight Russians. They were equipped with arms and ammunition by Americans. What did they do after Russians left in 1985 and 1987 and up to 2001? The fact that Osama bin Laden claims that he's responsible for the 9/11 is the only proof that we have. Other than that, there is absolutely nothing linking Osama bin Laden other than his own admission. Let me tell you a few things about it. The 9/11 Commission categorically failed in assigning blame. I'm not saying it's my commission, it's the US government commission. It makes a good read. Have a read of it and see how blame is held and who's held responsible for that. What is also on record is that the Taliban government actually asked around, say, take him away. This myth that the Taliban were not willing to give up Osama bin Laden is not true, it's a myth. My good colleague, I was a journalist in Pakistan, my colleague from Peshawar for the newspaper, he in fact is on record communicating the Taliban, Mullah Umar's telephone call to the government of Pakistan saying they're willing to give him up. But nobody wanted to talk at that stage. The bottom line is this, that Pakistan is now in a state of war. The people of Pakistan realize it. The government and the military sides with Americans. The fact that the Americans and NATO are involved in Afghanistan and have been there and will unceremoniously leave in a few years, I think it's 2013, shows how poorly planned this whole process was. The intervention in Afghanistan was poorly planned, poorly executed. The guilt was assigned to the Taliban without realizing who was responsible. And the question you have to ask yourself before you have American troops or others interfere in Pakistan, have you done your job in Afghanistan? Have you solved the Afghan problem? Before we worry about the $500 per capita GDP in the tribal areas, have we resolved what we wanted to resolve in Helmand, in Kandahar, in Kabul? If I were to tell you that after billions of dollars spent and at least $20 billion of Canadian taxpayers, the people in Kabul do not get electricity for even 5 hours a day, and most people, Afghans living in Kabul cannot afford to pay rent or own a house in Afghanistan or in Kabul. There's no security in Kandahar or Helmand, where Canadian troops are in Kandahar and American troops are in Helmand. So you ask yourself, after such a tremendous military exercise in Afghanistan, you have failed to achieve or deliver anything of consequence, anything of significance. Neither the infant mortality rate has changed in Afghanistan, nor is the literacy rate. And now we say, let's go and attack Pakistan. And if you read New York Times, they are already rallying the troops to attack Iran. Pakistan has to stop its relationship with the United States. It has to culminate it completely. We don't want a relationship between Pakistan military and ISI and American CIA and Pentagon. And I'm not saying that we don't need a relationship between Pakistan and the United States. I'm saying that we need a relationship between Pakistani artists and the American artists. We need a relationship between Pakistani universities and American universities. We need a relationship between Pakistani trade unions and American trade unions. We need a relationship between Pakistan civil society and the American civil society. What we don't need is the American military bribing its way into bombing civilians in Pakistan. What we don't need is the violation of sovereignty. Now, I'm not going to make a legal argument here, but the moment you attack a sovereign state, you're violating its sovereignty. We are fortunate in Canada that the war we are waging in Afghanistan has largely stayed in Afghanistan. Imagine if they choose to bring that war here in Canada. Then we will have something to worry about. Thank you.
I would like to invite Mr. Kamran Bukhari to speak for the motion.
That's the time, right?
No, I'm doing it.
Okay, cool. Okay, I had my notes, but Professor Heather's comments have basically blown them away. There are a few things that I do want to point out that are factual issues. First of all, it is the ISI that is resenting the CIA and the Pentagon involvement in Pakistan. That is why we have tensions between the United States and Pakistan right now, is that the state of Pakistan is trying to renegotiate the rules of the game. So yes, this is the reality. Should we have artists and artists meeting each other? Yes, in a perfect world, yes. But this world is not perfect. This world is, short, nasty, brutish, in the words of Thomas Hobbes, and that is the reality of life. So I'm going to try to sort of shine light on what it is. Should the United States violate Pakistani sovereignty? No. But in an ideal world, in a real world, what happens? Pakistan cannot take care of the problem. if it cannot take care of the problem, and that problem is creating problems for others, then those others will come in. That is just the reality. International law, one of my professors once said to me that if you forget everything that we have taught you in this class, just keep one thing in mind, and that is that law is politics. In other words, law is not a tablet from the sky that is set in stone. Law is determined by the political reality on the ground. In a perfect world, yes, there shouldn't be any violation of sovereignty, but as Professor Hather spoke about the cause and effect, I think the cause and effect that my partner, Professor Baumgartner, put out was very accurate. There was no need. The United States was not interested in going into Afghanistan. The United States had no business. The CIA was still chasing Russian spies at the time of 9/11. 9/11 was a wake-up call. In other words, there was a need to go into Afghanistan, and I'd like to set the record straight. Mullah Omar refused to hand over Osama bin Laden, not just to the Americans, but to the Pakistanis, as well as the Saudi intelligence chief who made a personal trip asking for Osama bin Laden well before 9/11. So there is a reality to which the United States responded. Now, Pakistan, as I mentioned earlier, is either unable or unwilling or a function of both in terms of its need to actually crack down on these people. Because as my partner laid out, that in contrast with 3,000 American lives, 3,000 some American lives, some 30,000 some Pakistani lives have been lost. So Pakistan has all the more need to crack down. But Pakistan obviously does not have the resources, and it has complications in terms of its intent as well, because Pakistan has too many stakeholders pulling policy in different directions. So therefore, the United States cannot sit on its with its hands on its lap and say, okay, well, we'll wait for you to solve things out, and meanwhile the next attack either in Pakistan or in Afghanistan or somewhere else is being planned. Thank you. So, and keep in mind that drone strikes are not things that are done randomly. They are intelligence-driven operations. They are based on real-time intelligence. Now, will that intelligence be faulty, and will innocent people get killed? Yes, that does happen, and it's unfortunate. Well, no one condones it, but that's just a fact of life. That is the reality of life. So, if there is intelligence, you cannot allow it to become stale. You have to act on it. And this is based, and keep in mind that these drone strikes were not an American imposition on the Pakistanis. The Musharraf government gave permission. The ISI for the longest time worked with the Central Intelligence Agency, and I am privy to these operations as well, because this is the kind of work that I do, that the ISI and the CIA were running ops together. At one point, there was a disagreement. The disagreement was on targets. The Pakistanis had faced a situation where there was the rise of the Pakistani Taliban. The Pakistanis wanted the Americans to target Pakistani Taliban. The Americans were more interested in targeting Al-Qaeda. And so, therefore, there is a reality here. There is a prior partnership. So the idea of violation of sovereignty does not hold water. Then you must ask yourself, where have all the major Al-Qaeda and transnational jihadist figures been captured? Pakistan. Pakistan is jihadist central of the world. Why? Not because of its own choosing. It's a function of geography. If you squeeze non-state actors in Afghanistan, where are they going to go? They're not going to, vanish into thin air. They will make their way across either the Iranian border, and there is a structural reality called the Islamic Republic of Iran, and it's on the other side of the sectarian divide. Al-Qaeda doesn't really have a good, hospitable terrain there, but the only other option is Pakistan. And Pakistan was the gateway for many militants to land in Afghanistan during the 1990s. I would make the argument that the ISI was negligent in the 1990s, because if it was supporting the Taliban, that was fine at that point in time. But at the same time, it did not cater to Pakistan's national interest, because they allowed Al-Qaeda and were either negligent, or they allowed Al-Qaeda to take shape in Afghanistan, and it came back to haunt them. About the drone strikes. This is much more complicated than just simply a sentiment against, about, sovereignty is being violated. if there have been polls taken by Pakistani think tanks of the FATA and the surrounding areas as to what is their opinion about drone strikes. And there is a shocking revelation that they say the drone strike, many people say that they welcome the drone strikes because life under the Taliban and Al-Qaeda is hell. Since the Pakistani security forces cannot do anything for it, they say, okay, maybe this is a blessing in disguise that the United States is striking with UAVs and Hellfires and Predators and Reapers. Is there resentment? Yes, there will be resentment. There will always be resentment. But it is not black and white. In other words, there is a very complex, nuanced reality that one ignores when one just focuses on the violation of the sovereignty issue. How much time?
10 seconds.
I'm done.
Okay, like my predecessors, I've had to put my notes aside since to some extent the wind has been taken out of their sail by previous comments. But I would like to say a couple of things in regard to this debate. The first thing that I'd like to start with is to point out that to a large extent, I think we need to, in order to understand the problems in Iraq, put them in their proper context. And in that sense, I would like to go back to some extent to the comments made by my debating partner about causality. The causality that has brought Pakistan to the current moment. Now, I'm not going to argue that Pakistan is not of concern, or that instability in Pakistan is not of concern to the international community. I think it would be ridiculous to do so, given that Pakistan is, among other things, a nuclear-armed state, and that therefore the destabilization of a nuclear-armed state, whether that results in the falling of nuclear weapons into the hands of terrorist groups, or whether it simply results in unauthorized use of nuclear weapons for other reasons, in particular with respect to Pakistan's longtime arch enemy India, is a matter for debate, but it is nonetheless clearly of concern. The main problem, however, to me is that insofar as the United States has become involved and that the international community has become involved in Pakistani affairs, it has tended, in particular in the last 10 years, to make the situation worse rather than better. In that regard, I would like to point out that regardless of how much Pakistan may insist on its sovereignty and may in the future months insist that the U.S. refrain from interference within its own borders, ultimately international relations functions according to a simple rule. And that simple rule is that the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And as much as we might regret that situation, the United States is extremely powerful, and as long as it perceives its interests to be furthered by going into Pakistan, it will in all likelihood do so, regardless of what the international community, or for that matter, the government of Pakistan does. However, the United States and Pakistan, as our other panelists have pointed out on a number of occasions, have a long history of working together. That long history began long before September 11th, began back in, some would say in the 60s, some would say in the 70s, but certainly what is fairly clear is that during the Cold War, the strategic interests of Pakistan and the United States to a large extent coincided. And those strategic interests were primarily in the containment of the USSR, and for Pakistan and the United States as well, the containment of Indian influence. And the two were seen to a large extent as being synonymous. In other words, the United States perceived India to be a threat to its interests because of its non-aligned status and its closer ties to the Soviet Union. And certainly Pakistan saw India as a major threat to its sovereignty. Under those circumstances, the United States developed deep ties with the Pakistani military, with the Pakistani intelligence services, and saw Pakistan, especially beginning with Zbigniew Brzezinski's involvement under the Carter administration and immediately after that under the Reagan administration, as an opportunity to provide the Soviet Union with its own Vietnam, and saw Islamic fundamentalism as the main means of delivering that. In a very simplistic way, Ronald Reagan saw the contest as between godless communism and the free world. And godless communism was opposed by Christianity just as much as it was by Islam. And in that sense, Christianity and Islam were able to make common cause against the atheist communist conspiracy, as they saw it. That resulted, of course, as most of you know, in the development of the groups that eventually led to the Taliban, eventually led to Al-Qaeda. The defeat of the Soviet Union changed the picture rather drastically, although the impact of that didn't necessarily affect Pakistan until September 11th. September 11th brought about a drastic transition in the strategic interests of the United States, in that the United States, from that moment forward, saw Islam and fundamentalist Islam in particular as primarily problematic. And that essentially threw Pakistan into a tailspin. Basically, the involvement in Afghanistan, which furthered both American goals and Pakistani goals insofar as that the Indian government had close ties to the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan, and that therefore the defeat of the Soviet-backed government in Afghanistan was a strategic victory for Pakistan as well as for the United States. Suddenly, in the context of September 11th, the United States asked Pakistan to make a drastic about-face. A drastic about-face that India very quickly took advantage of, insofar as that India recognized very quickly that it could take advantage of this emphasis on Islamic fundamentalism. In other words, the intervention in Afghanistan crucially strengthened India at the expense of Pakistan. And the Pakistani state in this regard has been torn ever since. And it seems to me that while Pakistan recognized that it had absolutely no choice but to facilitate, to some extent, the response to September 11th by the United States, it nonetheless has viewed its strategic interests as fairly consistent, as its strategic interests still being primarily focused on India, the situation in Kashmir, and therefore a pro-Indian government in Afghanistan as a threat to its ability to meet its external threats. That essentially has served to destabilize the Pakistani state. The Pakistani state is torn on the one hand between its commitment to cooperate in the fight against Islamic terrorism, but on the other hand in not wanting to abandon its long-term strategic interests. And all indications to me seem to point to that the ISI to this day maintains at least reasonably good relations with the Afghani Taliban, even if not with the Pakistani Taliban. And I think that there are steep divisions within the Taliban themselves, and that it is not willing to let go of those. And one reason for that is because of its perception, and I don't think that's altogether inaccurate either, that the United States is not staying in Afghanistan in the long term. And it's becoming more and more clear from day to day that the United States will move out. And once it moves out, Pakistan will want to take advantage of those strategic assets that it has maintained throughout the previous 10 years in this war on terror. So I'll leave it at that.
That was an enthralling round of debate, and I would like to invite all the speakers to come up for a refutation speech, a rebuttal for 3 minutes, starting with Professor Baumgartner, then Mr. Bukhari and Mr. Haider, and followed by Fulfill Your Gets. Same sequence as the motion.
Thank you. I don't know if I'll use the whole 3 minutes or not, but I just jotted down some notes while I was listening. I just want to respond to like a few things that were said. I don't understand why someone would bring up a conspiracy theory that bin Laden wasn't responsible for 9/11, so I'll just kind of leave that alone. But also the argument that Pakistan is better off with the U.S. That Pakistan would be better off not having the U.S. as an ally. I think that's just wrong. I think Pakistan needs to look at its security interests, and I think Pakistan's security interests are best served with the U.S. as an ally. Basically, kind of cutting ties with the U.S. Would do nothing, but it would push the U.S. more toward India. I don't see why that would be in Pakistan's interest. It would also, Pakistan needs the help of the U.S. in fighting the Pakistani Taliban, which, as I said, have killed all these people, have used terrorism in Pakistan. So I don't see why I just don't see why that's a good argument. Secondly, there were a few other arguments. Honestly, I really haven't heard an argument on the opposition side that really supports their argument that the U.S. shouldn't be intervening in Pakistan. I heard an argument that the U.S. supported radical Islam during the Afghan-Soviet war. And yeah, that's true, but it doesn't support the argument that the U.S. should not be intervening in Pakistan today. You know, that decision, you have to look at security interest. You have to look at today's political realities. Also, it was brought up that the U.S. mismanaged the war in Afghanistan. Again, that's true. The U.S. did mismanage the war in Afghanistan. But once again, that does not support the argument that the U.S. should not be intervening in Pakistan today. Whether or not the U.S. should continue to be active there, you have to look at the security interest of the U.S., you have to look at the security interest of Pakistan, and I think those countries, you know, that they have to take that into consideration. And when you take that into consideration, it's very important that the U.S. and Pakistan remain allies with one another. They have a long history of being allies. I think their alliance, I think their relationship is something that is, you know, for better or worse, has been something that both countries will need to continue. Thank you.
The question is not that we should have a relationship between the United States and Pakistan. The question is what kind of a relationship. The question is not about the fact that Taliban are out of step with the world we live in today. The question is not about that the Taliban are a violent manifestation of a violent orthodoxy. That's not the question. The question is, what can we do about it? Now, let me say this. Since between 2003 and 2011, 3,900 Pakistani troops have died. That's a fact. Between 2003 and 2011, 11,300 Pakistanis have died out of violence. That is a fact. And between 2003 and 2011, 21,800 insurgents or terrorists have died in Pakistan. Now, question I ask you to think about. What can US do in Pakistan more than what Pakistani military have been able to do? I just told you that Pakistani military claims it has killed 23,000 plus insurgents. And let's assume that all were insurgents and no civilians. And by the way, let me also tell you, no one is doing the count. This is an unverified count. So we don't know if the bomb decimated a place, was it civilians or terrorists? But let's say there are 25,000 terrorists that were killed. Now you have American soldiers on ground or in the air. How many more they would have to kill to say, mission accomplished? We saw that banner, mission accomplished, on an American fleet where they declared victory in Iraq, and now there is an anti-American government there. There's a Shia government who doesn't want to have anything to do with the US. They're grateful they got rid of Saddam. They're grateful to Americans, but it is not the government that they wanted to have. Look at Afghanistan. Americans will leave Afghanistan as is. There's not a single big difference made. Now, the reason I say that is that Taliban came into power in Afghanistan not because they were powerful. It was because the Americans asked the ISI to enable Afghanistan. There's not a single madrasa in Pakistan that teaches you how to fly jet planes. Taliban were flying jet planes. That was an ISI war. They made Taliban happen. Once you take that impetus, that incentive away, Taliban disappear. The way they will disappear after 2013. If you look at Afghanistan's history, Afghans, not just Afghans as in Afghanistan, but Pashtuns fight at their own time. If they can beat you today, they'll fight with you. If they cannot beat you today, they will pack up, go back, start their agriculture again, wait for a generation, or the next, or the one after that, and then they will fight. In 2013, Americans will leave, but we will be left with the same mess that they've created in Iraq, after they've created in Afghanistan, and now my colleagues want you to create the same mess in Pakistan. Don't buy this argument.
Okay. For the record, we're not saying that the United States should be allowed to make a mess of the situation. What we are saying is a reality. Is it called intervention? Is it bad? We're discussing the issue on its merit, and I will echo what Professor Baumgartner said earlier, that so far we've not seen any strong arguments from the other side proving that that the United States should not intervene, or making a strong case for that. Again, fact check, the Taliban were not flying jet airplanes. The Taliban were a light infantry force that emerged in Kandahar. The ISI woke up to the Taliban and then switched sides from Hikmatyar to the Taliban. So that was one piece of fact check that I wanted to do. What kind of relationship? Well, here's the thing. We can debate what the nature of relationship and how one should behave until we're blue in the face. But the reality is that we live in today. We deal with today. Washington will have to deal with what kind of government that exists in Pakistan, or for that matter, any country. And therefore, the onus is on the Pakistanis to pursue their interests. If that's not what the U.S. does. The U.S., like any other power in the history of mankind, small, big, medium-sized, will always pursue its interests. It is the responsibility of those who are leading Pakistan, be it their military, intelligence, or political leadership, to pursue the interests of Pakistan and be able to negotiate a better deal with the United States. It is not the fault of the United States that Musharraf basically said, it's fine, let's do drone strikes. And he didn't ask anybody. That's not the job of the United States. The United States has to pursue its interests, and if you put anybody else in that situation, they will behave the same way. Is it good? No. But does it happen? Yes, it does happen. As for what kind of world the United States is leaving after the U.S. jihadist war, yes, Professor Murtaza Haider is absolutely correct. It's a mess. But the United States never wanted Iraq to be democratic. Don't let propaganda fool you otherwise. The United States is not interested in leaving Afghanistan as a mirror image of Wisconsin. That's not going to happen. The United States does not care what the nature of government will be in Afghanistan. The only goal from day one until now is that these stateless transnational jihadist actors are not able to wage war from Afghan soil or from another soil. Thank you.
It's perhaps a little unfair that we get the last word, and there's a definite advantage to having the last word, but nonetheless, that's been thrust upon me. What I'd like to basically say is that we started out this debate by asking, is the instability in Pakistan a concern to the international community, and does that instability justify outside intervention by the United States in particular? I would argue, and I would continue to argue, that it is precisely outside intervention in Pakistan that has created the instability that is the problem in Pakistan. In essence, what happened after 9/11 is that the United States asked Pakistan not only to declare war on their former allies in Pakistan and in Afghanistan and to cooperate with that, but to a substantial extent also to declare war on its own population. The occupation of the Swat Valley is a very good example, which created several million internal refugees in order to round up supposedly 20,000 militants. We don't know the exact numbers. But the reality from everything that I have seen is that American involvement in Pakistan is deeply unpopular. And to the extent to which the government is perceived as cooperating with that intervention or with those actions on the part of the United States, it becomes delegitimized. And consequently, the state in and of itself becomes less stable. And I think that ultimately it's the stability of the Pakistani government that is of interest to the international community. But to the extent that we've seen outside intervention, it has not improved the situation. It has made the situation considerably worse and has served in essence to undermine the authority of local governments and their ability to act to meet these kinds of threats. Ultimately, it is the inability of the Pakistani state to function as a state, and the first and foremost aspect of that is to maintain a monopoly on the legitimate use of force that creates the environment within which insurgent groups like the Taliban, both on the Afghani side and on the Pakistani side, are able to function. And that, I think, is not going to be helped by greater intervention on the part of the United States. Drone strikes, while I would agree that they are far superior to boots on the ground, to an actual invasion, are probably far more precise, nonetheless undermine the authority of the Pakistani state if it is perceived as cooperating with them. And the recent reports that came out that the United States has not only targeted intelligence intelligence targets that were identified, but subsequently targeted the first responders and subsequently targeted funerals for those that were killed in those adventures, I think it does a great deal of damage and not a great deal of good.